All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another in our BrandQ webinar series. Today is on color bars and control strips, what, where, and stories of joy and woe. Stories of joy and woe. We're privileged to have Ron Ellis, who I'm going to turn it over to in a second here, who's been really moderating, putting these together, along with Bruce Bain, Dan Uris, hopefully I'll pronounce that fine, Mark Richard and Guy Page are coming. There's some other folks coming with Mark, and you guys can kind of introduce yourselves as you get to that point. Just a quick little note for everybody. We are recording the webinar, so you will get a recording of the webinar. It'll come typically like in 24 hours, maybe 24 to 48 hours. It'll come from Tim Baechle from Idealliance, our Vice President at Idealliance, and it'll come from him, and he is traveling right now, so expect the recording about 24 to 48 hours. Also, you can ask a question at any time by typing in the chat box on your right into the chat box, and you can send it to a presenter or you can send it to me, the host, and I'll make sure it gets asked at the end. We'll take all the questions at the end, but you can ask a question at any time into that chat box, and then we'll send out that recording in 24 to 48 hours. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ron Ellis, and Ron, you can take it away as far as our webinar for today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Steve. So good afternoon, good morning, good night, for depending on where you are. But welcome to our BrandQ webinar for the month of April. And I'll introduce myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about BrandQ a little bit later. But I'm a consultant. I work in the Northeast of North America. And I spend a lot of time working with brands and a lot of time working with printers. So one of the topics that comes up very often has to do with measurement and color bars and what should be on them and where should they be placed. And that's what our topic today is. I'm also a print properties chair. And right before this, we had a print properties meeting where we were talking about the new ISO documents and how they may be updated and paper colors and all these interesting things. But print properties, if you're an Idealliance member, it's a great place to learn and keep up with what the industry is doing. So you can email me if you're interested in being part of that group. It's where a lot of innovations come out of. Also, I'm a G7 and a BrandQ trainer, and I'll talk about BrandQ a little bit later, but I want to get us into our topic. But the whole idea of BrandQ is to help the brands and supply chain communicate and providing education, assessment, and tools that they can use to talk to each other. And a big part of that is color management. So our other presenters we have today, we have Dan Uris, and he's the CTO of MeasurePoint. He's very, very experienced, so he's on press all the time. He's watching measurements. And prior to MeasurePoint, Dan worked for many years with X-Rite. So he was a X-Rite distributor and spent a lot of years dealing with IntelliTrax and all the other instruments and knows quite a bit about measurement. So we're very lucky to have him. And that is a screen from his software. I've just popped that up. There's not many advertisements during this, but this is one I gave him. That's his G7 mode that gives corrective action of what somebody should do, and you can see the little score in the upper right there showing where the job is. Also, we have Bruce Bain, and he is the owner and founder of Spot On, which is another software that's used for measuring and doing quality control and analysis. And Bruce is co-chair of Print Properties Group and was co-chair of Baechle for many years as well, and we've worked together a lot of years, and one of the smartest guys. Most of the Idealliance test charts that you use if you work with Idealliance programs were either built or kind of fixed or vetted by Bruce. So if you have trouble reading a test chart, he's the guy to yell at. And this is a screen from Spot On Verify. Now, typically it would have a Delta E mode in there, but this is showing a control strip, and then you can see in here there's something called CRF, which shows you a visual match and stacking of the Delta E's. Something very interesting, and just an example of the software and the tools that he's built. Also on the phone and with us is Mark Richard, who's going to be showing what he does. Mark Richard is the tech manager and the guy in charge of color management at Westrock, Montreal, and very, very hands-on but very technical. So he's going to show how he analyzes the difference between the color bar and the work in the middle of a job, and this relates to the color bars that are in the middle of the sheet versus what the pressman is measuring up top. And very, very interesting. I saw this the other day, and I I asked Mark if he would share it because it's very fascinating, a very good example of control and how a press gets controlled and what these differences can or can't be. So we're going to start, and first thing I'd like to do is have Mark show this. So if you can pass this over to Mark, Steve, and he can kind of show and explain a little bit of what he did and talk a little bit about why they did it. And you can see an example of how a really, really good printer controls, you know, the color across the sheet and make sure that what's on the color bar relates to what's on the sheet.
Okay, so Mark, I passed you control, and at the top left of the screen, it'll say File, Edit, and Share. Just click the button to Share, and then My Screen. Where it says File, Edit, Share, just share my screen, and then we'll be able to see your screen. In the very upper left.
You may have to click it. Yeah, there you go. Excellent.
Do you see it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, my name is Roger Britton. I work with Mark Richard, and I will be doing the verbal or the audio part of the presentation. Mark is on the computer doing the navigating between the documents. So what you see here is a PDF of the actual test form, actually a printing form for the job. The job is packaging for some product, and as you can see, it's laid up multiple times across the sheet width. And what we have is on each of the product an area that's called the glue flap, and in the glue flap the customer is wise enough to incorporate a control strip that we can read and measure, and from which the customer is also using to control the color at their end once they receive the final product. So at our end, when we run the job, when we start the job, of course we look at our color bars at the very top of the sheet, and to get us into a printable ballpark or range of the target colors that we are expected to hit. But the trouble is always, what is the relationship between the measurements that we are getting from our automatic scanning instruments, such as X-Rite and Teletrax, and the measurements that are inside the job that the customer will evaluate us on? And that's always a million-dollar question. So we wanted to address this issue once and for all, and we went ahead and built sophisticated spreadsheet to collect the data from individual control strips from each of the positions in the printing form. What you're seeing here right now is a subset of all the jobs, because the jobs is actually imposed 16 up, and we all decided we're going to measure the center of the sheet, not all 16 ups. So what we do is we set up first the reference. Spécialiste sur les références. Mark is going to go on the reference. So what you see here on the right is the references, and this is using the G7 method, of course. So the white, the paper white serves as the reference to calculate the expected LED color or the delta CH of the grays. And so we have that set up in that area. We also set up in that area the target LED numbers for the primaries and the overprints. And also we have spot colors in there. So as well, we have target LED for the spot colors that we enter in that area of the spreadsheet. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is the fancy calculations that lead to the score of the sheet. And the idea here is to be able to collect the data from individual control strips and have the Excel sheet automatically calculate or compute the score, the same way that the customer is going to get it in the final report. So let me turn to the first tab. The first, what you see at the bottom, if you can see that area, is individual tabs for different pulls as we run through the production. And so we have, on this example, we have a pull at 1,000 sheets, we have a pull at 2,000 sheets, and so on. And what you see at the top is the 8-up, the result of the 8-up. So what we do is we painstakingly, with a spectral, Teshcon SpectroDance 4, thank you very much, SpectroDance, to have a handy scan mode. So we use this very small, the smaller of the two apertures available on the instruments, the 1.5 millimeter aperture, and then we, have the instrument attached to the computer with the help of their software called SpectroDance Connect. And once we put the instrument over the strip, and we press and hold the button, and then we scan from left to right or right to left, and then that's what captures the data from the sheet, from the strip. And then that gets copied through the clipboard over in that Excel sheet. And we repeat the operation for all 8 positions that we are inspecting. And on the right-hand side, we tabulate the totals. And then we can calculate the statistics. And the statistics that matters most to us is the statistics, the scoring on the CMYK and the scoring on the spot colors. And, of course, the average of the two. And as you can see in this example, we are getting 98%. It's not perfect, but we are always working on improving our process. So once we have that under control, then we turn to the final report as the customer sees it, as the customer receives it. And this is what Mark is showing right now. So the report shows, if you can draw your attention to the upper right-hand side, the number that shows up over there shows 87%. So at 87% is what we're looking for. And we want to have the same number showing up in that area as the numbers returned from our individual measurements of the strips, because this number, all the data that shows up on this sheet all come from the color bar. They come from the color bar readings. So these are the numbers collected from the IntelliTracks. So we have the LEBs, and then we know what the target LEBs ought to be for the CMYK colors and the spot colors. And the calculation under the hood is the same calculation we use in our Excel spreadsheet. So in the end, we have 2 kinds of units that we can compare, comparing apples with apples. So we were satisfied that we would establish a continuity between the color bar readings and the individual control strips in each of the product. So from that point on,
let's keep going. Sorry, Roger. Finish. Yep.
Okay. From that point on, we stopped collecting individual readings on each up because we didn't, that would be duplicating or giving us redundant results. If we are able to rely on the measurements returned by the color bar, then that's all we need to track. And one important key to the success of this, I have to mention in passing, is that the design of the individual boxes is varnished. And at the beginning, when we started on this, we didn't have varnish on our color bar. So there was a discrepancy between the measurements we were getting from the color bars and the measurements we were getting from the individual strips. And the moment that we started to apply the varnish to the color bars, Well, that's when the two start to agree very well, and that's pretty much our process.
So that was, can you flip the screen back, Steve? So that was pretty interesting, because the thing that's fascinating there is that the reports that they get, and their configuration goes in through an IntelliTracks and then through Measure Color and then pops out to the same report the customer uses. But the fascinating thing there is that this correlation between what happens in the middle of the press sheet and what happens on the color bar. And anybody who's done a lot of printing may be aware that very often there is not a good correlation. So to see that correlation there is actually, quite amazing. It's speaks to how they do press maintenance and the type of work they do. Mark does very, very well, and to take that time and chart and plot all those different elements on the sheet and compare it to the color bar is pretty neat. It's I don't know, Bruce and Dan, it's quite amazing, eh? Bruce, Dan?
Yep, I'll say so. Sorry, I was muted. Yes, that was pretty good. He also stole my thunder on the next slide.
Okay, good. But we have lots of stuff to talk about, so we can move past it. But absolutely, that's pretty unique to get that level of agreement between your color bars and your actual work on the page. So quite impressive.
Mark, Ron, it's Guy speaking. If I can just add one. How are you doing? One thing I would like to add to that from a management standpoint is that when you have that kind of data from left to right to up to down, this is the kind of very smart discussion you can engage with your maintenance team, because they can see variation, they can understand. When you talk to them about a variation, most of the time they would like to know where it's appearing and in which deck or how it's appearing. Is it front, back? Is it? And this is the kind of stuff that really helped us also to shape a discussion with our maintenance group and preventive maintenance on printing deck. We work at it very differently since this kind of work has been put in place here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Very good job, P. So the three quick stories we were going to tell before we get into it were things that we've all seen in printing plants that talk about color bars and what we run into. So Bruce, you were going to mention coatings, which Roger had just mentioned.
Correct.
The one that
unfortunately nothing's showing up on the screen.
Really? How about now? No.
No.
Yes. No. Okay. I'll get
now. There it is. There it is. It's right there now. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Jokingly, yeah. I was glad to hear him say something like that, because he was talking some real world stuff. My example in that regard, I was just recently at a G7 requalification for a customer, and they had coated the entire job with a gloss aqueous, but they had not coated the color bars, and I didn't notice it at first, and we were going along, and what I was reading in the job, and remember we're taking P2P charts and other charts to evaluate the press sheet, at RAT for Idealliance for the master printer situation, and the measurements they were taking across the back of the sheet with their inline, their spectra on the console were completely different than what I was reading within the job. And I looked at the sheet, and sure enough, they had not coated the bars. And it's a continuous example of if you don't coat the control bars and treat the control bars as if they're part of the job, then you don't have any correlation between what the pressman's seeing as they're running the job and what the job actually winds up looking like, especially to somebody else measuring the bars that are in the glue flap or other part of the work. So I think it's important. The unfortunate thing with that also is that if you If you are coating the bars with a gloss coating, the measurements are very similar to what the operator is used to measuring on an uncoated sheet. The second you start to go to a matte coating or some other coating that is not reasonably glossy, you wind up having to adjust the press to compensate for that, just like you would going to an uncoated sheet. You don't print with the same densities on an uncoated sheet that you do on a coated sheet. So oftentimes I think the operators wind up thinking it's a lot easier not to coat the bar and just use one set of measurements, but I think you're kind of fooling yourself in that process if you don't coat the bars.
Yeah, and the typical story that I see, which maybe those guys illustrated very well, is except for theirs agree, but very often I'll be at a printer where there will be some work in the middle of the sheet, and there'll be a little brand color bar, and there'll be the color bar that the pressman's reading, and very often those don't agree, and that's what Mark had just demonstrated was, how those can agree and how they correlate that. And then Dan, you can talk just for a second about automation and what you see.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Certainly what I've observed is that the best color bar is the one that the operators actually take the time to measure. A lot of work takes place up front to build a color bar that has all these different attributes, but a lot of times we still see operators measuring in the press room with handheld devices. Now I'm going to be generous and say with a handheld device you can make about one measurement every 5 seconds. And again, I think that's being a little generous. I think it's probably a little slower than that in reality. So typically I would see an operator spend about 1 minute making measurements around the sheet. Well, if you think about 5 seconds per, that's only 12 measurements made in that time. Now, if you consider a 40-inch Heidelberg press, typically you have 32 zones, and most commonly we see people using minimum patch sizes so that they can fit 10 different patches inside each zone. That's 320 patches across the whole color bar. If your operator were to try to measure that with a handheld measuring every patch, it would take them over 26 minutes to do. Come up to a little bit of a bigger press, a 65-inch KBA, again, 540 patches now across 54 ink zones. You've got 45 minutes of work to measure one sheet. Obviously not realistic, but a lot of good information is available to be had in that color bar if only we could measure it. This is where automation comes in. Can you hear me, Ron?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's right. That's exactly
okay, I thought you were interrupting. But this is where automation comes in, and we've got a couple options from several different vendors on the market. Probably the two most popular would be X-Rite with its IntelliTrax, Peshcon with their Spectra Drive. Both of these devices can scan a 40-inch sheet, a 65 sheet in a matter of seconds. And then it relays all that information back to the operator so they know which attributes they need to adjust first and where they need to pay their attention. So in giving the operator the most information up front, automation really lends a great capability to understand what's going on in the sheet in the fastest amount of time possible.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the color bar, we're going to talk for a minute about what the color bar is and what it does. But the color bar matters mainly because the color bar is supposed to tell you what's happening on the sheet. That's the big idea. And I always look at it as a miniature test run because if you have a good color bar, you have everything you have on there to see: gray balance, solids, dot gain, overprints, slurs, doubling, all that. If you have enough on that color bar, you can get a lot of information from it. So I have a lot of customers who mail me press sheets and ask what's wrong. If that color bar has the right elements on it, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, then I can pretty much diagnose what happened on that press sheet, assuming it relates to the middle of the sheet. We'll talk for a minute right now about press control versus validation color bars and what the difference is. And let me have Dan talk first about the press control bar.
All right, thanks, Ron. So the purpose of a press control bar is to communicate the key attributes of the print production process. Typically, the person looking at this is the press operator, and they look at this data to make the adjustments required to meet those customer expectations. So from that color bar, generally they're looking at density, dot gain, color, overprints, gray balance, a lot more of these type elements that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. The benefit of these press control bars is typically they do span the sheet. They provide multiple locations of measurement, so operators know what's going on side to side. They can monitor their machine performance and also trend the natural variation of the manufacturing process. You know, a press is a physical machine. It varies over time and in environmental conditions. So again, analyzing and viewing all that data as quickly as possible is very valuable in monitoring how that machine is performing.
Yep. And then the audience, Dan, continue on, because that's
yeah, sorry. Steve, can you advance the slide?
Oh, I did. It should be advanced. Are you guys not seeing it?
I still see purpose and the press control, the 2 bullets.
Really? How about you, Bruce? Same thing?
Just came through.
It seems to have a really long lag.
Huh, interesting.
All right, well, it's here now. Now we're back. We went back one.
Oh, you do have a long lag. Okay, it'll come back. You can start talking, Dan.
Sure, yeah, I can certainly start talking about it. So generally speaking, the press control bar is viewed by the press operator. They're using it and the information it provides to adjust press settings live while the work is being run in production. This allows them to maintain the proper densities, impression, monitor their dot gain, color behavior, and everything else. But that's not the only audience of a press control color bar. So printing managers also utilize this vast collection of information to view trends over time. This is great for assuring consistency run to run and also determining what maintenance may be needed on the press and other attributes that are also contained in the bar. Also, these bars are used by pre-press technicians. Looking at this data on an aggregate on many jobs combined can be very useful in updating plate curves and also maintaining and monitoring proper gray balance.
Yeah, no, that's right. So that's one use of a color bar, which is the press control bar. The second use of a color bar is for validating work, and that would be, the bar that maybe a brand would drop in or on a proof. And Bruce, that's kind of your specialty. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Right. I take it you've already clicked over to the next slide, right?
I have. Yeah. I'm going to move to a different location.
There it is. Anyway, yeah, okay. So the main purposes of a validation bar is not to actually run the press by like a bar across the back of the sheet, but it's more for providing reports and evaluating how individual objects within the job, like that previous one that Mark had showed on the screen where there was a color bar associated with each individual object on the sheet, and also to verify proofs and validate performance of printing devices over an extended period of time, like a digital device or an inkjet device where you're just printing out a color bar and looking at it. They usually occupy one location, or if there's multiple locations in pretty much the same area on the object on the sheet. Sometimes they're omitted, which is unfortunate because there isn't any room on the press sheet for them, or on the actual carton or package that's being printed. The audience is multifold, actually. A quality assurance manager is monitoring print devices. So if you're monitoring an inkjet printing device to determine if it needs to be recalibrated, monitoring packaging from a print buyer perspective, is so that the print buyers or the people that are representing the print buyers are assuring that the package looks the same from plant to plant, from month to month, year to year. So on a store shelf, there's no discrepancy between one package from one manufacturer, printing manufacturer to another one. They're also validating additional attributes or patches that can't be included in a color bar because of the aforementioned space requirements on a press sheet. So you can add things like multiple gray patches or multiple tone patches that wouldn't have the space in a press control bar.
Yeah, and a couple examples you can see right here. These are just little pictures that I took, but you can see these are control bars that are placed on brands. So you can see there's graham crackers, there's drinks, there's toothpaste, there's some other stuff there, chocolate, I think. So these are just little bars that brands place on there, and they're very common. Obviously, if you walk through a grocery store, and anybody interested in this, like many of you, probably see those all over. But the relationship there, those bars are used for that control element and for working on that. And that brings up the question of what should be in a color bar. And, the main things, and it really depends on how much space do you have. So across the press sheet, you have quite a bit of space, so you can put a lot on it. But those little ones, if you look, like on the graham cracker box or places like that, they have only a little bit of space, so they have to actually pick what they look for. But generally, in the world of G7, we're looking for gray balance to see if the overall color is correct. Usually looking for solids and overprints to see if the ink is correct and the ink, acting with other inks, the overprinting is correct. And dot gain is used not so much by the brands, but used by the press operators for process control. So these are the typical things. And let me have Bruce talk just a little bit about some of the things that are in a color bar.
Yes, if solids are almost always the primary patches that are in a color bar. I like to think of both the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black as an ink film thickness gauge, and that's what the operators actually use when they're running the press. But it does give you a hint as to if you've got one of the colors out of a spec, it could add to dot gain in the actual project and wind up with like a cyan tint, too much cyan or too much magenta in the job. Also, the overprints are nice to have too, which are the solid cyan and magenta to create the blue overprint, magenta and yellow to create the red overprint, and cyan and yellow to create the green overprint. Because as the ink film thickness changes, you will see a change in the red, green, and blue overprint, so you can wind up with blue sky that is purple in the case of too much magenta, that kind of a thing. Tints give you a consistency of ink transfer from the lightest tints to the darker tints, so you can see if the midtones are gaining too much. Very important to at least have some of those in there. And then the min dot, particularly important to flexo because of the way flexo plates are made. The small, very small highlight dots can break off and not print properly, so it's good to be able to gauge exactly how well the flexo plates are printing in the lighter areas. And of course, gray balance, keeping the grays consistent is very important, because if you can keep the grays consistent, you're printing to a known G7 spec.
Yeah. And Dan, other things that you'd look for?
Absolutely. I mean, in addition to those marks which Bruce mentioned, which are very common, some other things you may want to consider adding either to your color bar or around your color bar, namely number one, takeoff bars. These are generally used in areas of low ink coverage. What the takeoff bars do is they help keep ink moving on the rollers, and this prevents ghosting and ink modeling in the image area. In addition to that, you'll commonly see registration marks scattered around the work that you can use to confirm proper alignment of the plates. And lastly, we want to consider our ink zone width and color bar definition repeat. Now, what's important to consider about these is how much they can vary from press type to press type. If we think, again, going back to the Heidelberg, typically those presses have an ink zone width, a space between ink keys, of 32.5 millimeters. Recent other presses by Komori, KBA, Mitsubishi, they're generally in the 30 millimeter zone width per key. Then you have some vintage presses to consider where ink keys were wider, about 35 millimeters. And my reason for mentioning all this is just you can't necessarily work with one single color bar design or shape, and you also need to be considerate of the instrument you're going to use to measure, because these changing zone widths will change your patch size. They'll change how many patches you can fit inside each ink zone, and again, that will determine how much information you can get out of that area per key. Ron, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about where to place these color bars.
Yep, so placement of these becomes really, really important. And, when you talk to printers, one of the first mistakes that you see that brands make is they basically start popping these color bars all over the place. And if those color bars live in a gutter or someplace where there is no ink coverage or takeoff, then you end up with something that doesn't actually relate to where the printing really is. So this placement becomes really, really important, meaning where is it, how big is it near some actual printing area? Is it near the edge of a sheet? So issues like that become really, really important because if the placement isn't correct, then the actual bar becomes useless, meaning it doesn't represent the actual work that it's supposed to be representing. For example, if it's beside an item instead of under it, so not in the ink train, then you can have a bar that looks really cool and gives you all this information, but the information has nothing to do with the actual printed product that you're trying to track. So I'll have Bruce talk a little bit about where they are, but that's probably not as important. And then we'll get into placement. Where do we actually put these things?
Yeah, where to place them is pretty important, like you just stated. On Flexo and gravure presses, you have very even inking across the sheet and not much consideration for any ink takeoff. So you can put bars pretty much anywhere, but they usually wind up being on the operator and gear side in the outside edges of the web. Probably because that's a good place for controlling consistency of pressure on the cylinders, and also it's probably the only area on the sheet that there's any extra room. Of course, if there are bars actually in the project itself, then you're going to have bars there also, but from a control standpoint, it's going to be on the outer edges around the cylinder. On wide format devices, you could put them almost anywhere because there's not much variation from sheet to sheet or across the roll on a well-calibrated wide format device. Litho, on the other hand, is quite a bit different. There's an issue with inking on a press, on a litho press, where the amount of ink that's being delivered to the sheet has a big impact on consistency and the ability for the operator to control the ink. Gripper and tail is also another area. Do you put the color bars at the gripper? Do you put the color bars at the tail? I think there'd be less print variation at the gripper, and more newer presses and print shops are migrating to putting the control bars on the gripper side of the press sheet. Takeoff, it's difficult to run control bars across a varying content of low coverage, medium coverage, and high coverage, and get really accurate results, or at least good data that represents how the press sheet is printing on an offset press. A lot of times they're put in gutters with takeoff bars to follow just one ink zone and get an assessment of how the press is printing, as opposed to across multiple ink zones and multiple takeoffs.
And so for somebody not used to ink zones, imagine on that there's 32 stripes going vertically, each one of those being a pressman area where they control ink. A color bar that runs straight up through one of those zones is more consistent than running across through many of them.
Correct.
Yeah. And then not only, and this comes up over and over, I see this as well, because people are always trying to save space, especially when they're placing them on brand objects. But not only where do they go, but how big are they and where do they fit? So Dan, with all your X-Rite reseller experience, you probably ran into that over the years, and you probably still do.
Well, it's funny. People try to use the absolute smallest patch size possible. They want to fit these marks in as many places as they can, yet sometimes they don't take size considerations into mind when they do that. So I want to talk about a couple things here, and first being the aperture required, and the aperture is how much area that we look at by the material and the process. You may have different needs for measuring a different size area based upon whether your work is on coated paper, corrugated box, film, or textile. And if you look at the pictures on the screen, I have various sizes of apertures kind of depicted there, from 2 millimeter up to 12 millimeter, which give you an idea about how large the patch would need to be in comparison, depending on what you're going to measure. So what you want to do is you need to figure out that for the material you're printing, what you're printing it on, and what instrument you're going to use, what is the perfect mix of size and material that you can measure, and what is the capability of your instrument. There are a great many number of measuring devices on the market today, many with different aperture sizes and options, and we need to figure out, which aperture size should we be using in our instrument and what size should we be sampling on our material. And this makes us consider, is there going to be enough room on the job or the sheet to fit the appropriate size mark and get the appropriate instrument in there to measure. I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with an instrument X-Rite had called the 939. To get its accuracy and to meet the specifications to which X-Rite made that device, the smallest aperture you could use was 4 millimeter. Now that has since been improved upon by the X-Rite Exact pictured here, which can go all the way down below 2. I think the smallest is 1.5, really getting in a small area. But again, you have to be especially considerate of the surface you're measuring on top of if that area will fit. And there are many different instruments to consider, whether it's a handheld, an automated scanner, an inline device if you're measuring on a web, or even a press room device, or excuse me, a pre-press room device like a X-Rite IO or ISIS for measuring profiling targets.
And then, of course, what are the danger spots? Where don't you want to put them? Because we always, I'm always noticing them in places where they're useless.
Yeah, and that's a funny thing. We see these really important control areas and they get placed in dead or danger areas because that's what was available on the sheet or in the flap, but that not necessarily represents the work that's inside. And this is why what Mark was showing early on in the presentation is so important. So let me just highlight some of those areas that you may want to use caution with, starting with the outer edge of the sheet. Number one, this is likely not in line with the important ink zones or areas of the artwork. So if you see these measurements you're taking off to the sides, you may not be getting enough ink coming through in that area. And again, the measurements taken there probably don't reflect the work which the customer is buying. Areas of no ink takeoff, again, they're going to give you a poor representation of what is actually of the material you're selling, so that's a bad idea. And we also want to be considerate of mixed form work. I see a lot of customers these days trying to get the absolute most out of their presses. This means mixing a variety of different labels, designs, packaging on the same sheet. They'll buy big 65-inch presses that can print all types of designs on the same sheet that they can go cut later and sell to all the different customers. But the problem is, unless those areas are kept consistent, which more often than not I see that they're not, you have all different things mixed in together, you're going to have varying takeoff side to side on the sheet, which is going to make it extremely hard on the operator to control if they have varying takeoff side to side. And it really raises the risk of an uneven sheet. And again, we want to always measure closest to the artwork that we're evaluating. If we're looking at measurements taken from one side of the press compared to artwork that's on a different side of the sheet, that's going to misinform the operators and give them incorrect direction as to how to adjust.
Yeah. So Dan, keep going. Talk about the content of the color bar and how does that match the work?
Yeah, I've got two examples here which I wanted to show just as two common examples of, what if your artwork is solid line colors? What if you're making this pizza box on the left? You can see it primarily uses two solid spot colors, a spot red and a spot green. So in this case, we can maybe measure inside the image area if that's important to us. But again, we're not going to use a 4-color process color bar when we have work like this with just two solid spot colors. Another thing is a lot of our common verification bars, depending on the age of the bar you're using, may be only designed for 4-color process work. Many printers these days are trying to utilize extended gamut using a 7-color printing process. And if you look at the two pictures of the hot air balloons I have here, you see what that balloon would look like on the left just using CMYK process colors. If you extend into CMYK OGB, you can see the balloon looks much nicer and much more vibrant, and it may show that way on the sheet. But to realize that in your data, you're going to have to use a control strip either in your color bar or in a verification bar that matches the work process that you're actually printing the design with.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is one of the most interesting topics, and this is shows a screen from MeasurePoint, which is Dan's software, but one thing that's the most interesting is what if there is no color bar? What if you measure the actual work itself? And that's a pretty neat idea. So Dan, you can kind of show what's going on there and talk about how that works.
Yeah, this is one of the greatest joys I've had in becoming a software developer. Back in my X-Write days, I would go into printing operations and the operators would be measuring their work, and I'd say, where's the right spot to measure on this sheet or on this carton? And you know the answer I got? Wherever I can get a pass. Now, I'm sure there's probably some chuckles going on the line, maybe you've heard that before, but typically what we see is operators will measure anywhere around the sheet till they can get a passing read, and if they do, sometimes they say that that's good material, that's their production, and they're going to run that press. Well, the problem with that is those areas that they found the pass may not represent what the print buyer, what the brand was actually looking for. Pepsi is kind of famous for this. They have what's called a MeasurePoint document that gets distributed to all companies that are going to run Pepsi work, and that shows them where to measure their work. Problem is these MeasurePoint documents typically end up in a QA lab. They don't make it out to press, and again, the operator measures wherever they can to find a good reading. Well, what we've tried to do is fix that communication problem. Instead of having that MeasurePoint document stuck in a QA lab, we put it into software where the software shows the operator a picture of whatever it is they're producing, as well as the critical inspection points as you see in this folding carton example on the screen. And we found that generally speaking, operators, if they're given that guidance, hey, they're going to be measured here and QA is going to check it in the same spot, they'll measure in those locations and they'll do what they wanted simply by solving that communication problem. And this assures the brand, the print buyer, they're getting the quality where it's important to them, where their brand image is reflected on shelf.
Yeah, pretty neat. The idea of actual no color bar in some instances for QC, but the actual product is the color bar. Common issues, Bruce, do you want to kind of address that? Some of the stuff that we see every day?
Yeah, some of that's been discussed earlier, but it's good to go over these issues. Color bars are on only one side of the cylinder. When you're talking flexo or gravure, those cylinders are pressed together to image the press sheet, and even on the narrow ones, all the way up to the very wide cylinders, if you don't have any way of identifying if you're overpressure on one area versus the other side, you definitely have to have bars on each side of those cylinders. Along the same lines in regards to offset printing is color bars that are in areas that have no coverage, like in gutters and such. They won't represent the sheet unless you put takeoff bars in there, so that's very important also. And color bars that actually aren't measured. There are so many times I've seen color bars and I've asked pressmen, well, what about these tints on these bars? Oh, we never measure them. We just measure the solids, and we don't even measure the rest of the color bars. So there's a lot of information that's being left out, and it's almost like the tip of the iceberg. If you're measuring solid ink density, that's good. It helps the operator because that's their primary control point for keeping ink consistent across the sheet, but it certainly doesn't tell you what's going wrong if something doesn't look right. And then, as I mentioned before, coatings, varnish, laminations that aren't covering the color bars. The color bar really needs to represent the job if you're using it as a control tool for that job. And color bars that don't have the artwork plate curves applied to them, if you're controlling a press, which most presses are controlled with some kind of curves applied to the plates to get G7 qualification or to accommodate dot gain and stuff. If that isn't applied to the color bars aren't telling the story of how the press is running. So those are some of the common issues. Thanks.
Yep. And then Dan, any words of wisdom on color bars?
Yeah, just kind of wrapping things up. I hope everybody understands the importance of color bars, but important to also consider is that there is no perfect color bar out there. Each color bar design that you're going to implement or your printers are already using very much depends on the work in the printing process. Whether you're doing an offset job, a flexo, gravure, digital, wide format, all of these different types of work potentially could utilize different color bars to get the best data back. So you must achieve a balance of objectives. Depending on what's important to your artwork, that's either going to be solid colors like on that pizza box, or gray balance maybe if you're going to go for that balloon. Your tint percentages are going to depend on your print method as well. In offset, many of my customers, they try to measure at 25, 50, and 75, where my Flexo customers are much more interested in, say, the min dot. How is their 2, their 5, their 10% patches performing, in addition to their 25s and 50s, 75s. One thing sometimes people forget to measure is the substrate. The substrate, the material that you're printing on top of, again, being a nice white paper, brown corrugated box, film, all of the material you're printing on top of plays a role in how the ink on top of it appears. If that substrate is changing color, it's going to change the way the ink appears on top of it. So measuring substrate is a critical element to include in your color bar. You always want to have that if possible. It's something you want to monitor and track as well. At the end of the day, the best color bar is the measured color bar. So finding something that you can get engagement and people to actually measure in production, that's going to be the winner for you.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we're going to go to questions here in just a minute. Steve, do you have questions lined up?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions that came in. Just for everybody, a reminder to send it into the chat box as far as if you have questions. Ron, did you have something? Or?
I'm just showing a few slides here that show BrandQ, and we'll send some information along with the email so you guys can learn about it. But want to make sure we get into our questions here and are able to answer as many as you guys have while everybody's here.
Okay. All right, so I'll read off a couple as they come in here to you, Ron, and then you can kind of answer them and go to the right person. So first one is from Carter. What about soft touch coating? Do we want that covering the color bars too? And what are the ramifications of ink densities?
I think, let me have Dan answer that, but on soft touch coatings, yes, we probably do want that on the color bar, and Dan, you can speak to that as well as the ramification of density.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and that density is going to be affected whether the coating were on or not. Typically, the most important thing for us, though, is that what you're measuring in that color bar is representative of the work. And we're willing to take into consideration that the color bar is coated and that is affecting the densities because we want that understanding of how it's impacting the work. So it's something we typically would accept.
Yeah, and I would agree too. You're trying to represent that piece of artwork in the middle, and the ink changes, the appearance changes, and you want to capture that.
And in the case of something like soft touch, that's a very rough surface. It's soft to the finger, but as far as an instrument measuring it and the way the eye sees the light reflecting off of it, the density is going to be quite a bit lower than if you had the color bars uncoated. The color bar would be on a coated sheet, very high density or normal density, if you will, and on that soft touch, it would probably be quite a bit lower, probably approaching, if not lower than uncoated sheet.
Yeah.
Another question here is, could you explain the takeoff a little more?
Yeah, either of you guys can pick that up, whoever wants to.
I actually wrote I wrote a little document about it because it's a little bit difficult to I think unless Dan, you have a real quick and easy way, but it's a little bit difficult to completely explain it because it's a phenomenon that I believe, unless somebody knows otherwise, that is pretty much a Alesso exclusive condition. Dan, do you have a quick, simple way of explaining it?
Not a quick, simple way of explaining it. I do agree, though, with what you're saying. That is more of a litho-oriented tool that is used there, where you got all this ink that's got to make its way from the pan through the ink train, through the keys, onto the material, onto the blankets, onto the material. All these steps, and if you don't have design on the plate that's pulling that ink through, it's going to build up, and it's not going to get down, and it's going to move across, and it's going to cause all types of problems. So including these takeoff bars to ensure ink is moving through the rollers, through the press, getting down on the sheet, these takeoff bars are areas that you're going to trim off anyway. So they are a tool to help you keep the quality going and not have very low coverage cause other problems. I think, like I mentioned, ghosting, modeling, stuff like that can happen when that proper ink takeoff is not happening naturally because of the artwork. So if the artwork's not doing it, we got to have takeoff bars to do it in areas of low coverage.
Well,
right. Printing needs ink, and if you talk to pressmen, if there's not ink on the sheet, then they find it very difficult to control.
Right. Areas of low ink coverage are less controllable by the press operator than the medium or high coverage areas. And in that regard, I remember I had a customer that had half the sheet had CMYK on it, the other half of the sheet only had magenta, yellow, and black. And the pressman was complaining to me that he couldn't get the cyan to be consistent on that side of the sheet. And I asked him, well, what's the coverage on the sheet? What does the sheet look like? And he explained to me, you know, one side CMYK, good coverage. The other side just had magenta, yellow, and black and no cyan. And I said, think about it. And he goes, oh yeah, no coverage. If I have no coverage or very little coverage, I can't control the ink. It's too little ink leaving the rollers, and the control process of putting ink on the rollers is reasonably coarse. It's not really that fine-tuned. So you need that ink moving off the rollers and onto the press sheet to be controllable.
Yeah, and if anybody knows about ink takeoff, probably it's Mark, because his job as a pressman is that's 100% of it. I mean, he's not a pressman; he's in charge of pressman, but his job in that press room for quality is a lot of it's related to that. When there's low ink coverage, it's very difficult.
Another question is, what aperture would you use or would you recommend for litho or flexo printed corrugate packaging? What aperture?
Big. Dan, you're the instrument man.
Yeah, in my personal preference, I would say 4 millimeter would be ideal. You would be better if you could do 8, but I'm going to be realistic and say you probably don't have control marks that would facilitate an 8 millimeter color bar. So I would try to avoid using anything smaller than 4. 4 is available on a majority of the instruments sold today. You can get it on an Exact, you can get it on a SpectraDens. So that is a good option for that type of corrugated material.
Yeah, and the danger for low res material and low line screen is bigger aperture is better, but the danger is most of the rest of your supply chain is probably using a 4 or small aperture. And you do get a different measurement with a different aperture. So if you change aperture size, your measurements may not match somebody else if they're going to be measuring it as well.
Well, and also on very coarse screen rulings, like that happens in corrugated, sometimes clear down to 45 line screen and such. If you have a small aperture, you can measure an area and an area is so small that it's in between dots and it says 0%, and then you can move the aperture over just a little bit and read the middle of one of the big dots and be at 100%. So what's the actual value?
Yeah, no, it's challenging. The challenging part being if you had a brand that was going to be reading what you're doing, you need to have the same aperture as them, or they need to have the same aperture as you. But now Dan has good experience for this, so I would go with what you said, Dan.
All right, so we got more questions coming in, the lightning round as we get towards our time here, but some more questions.
Yeah.
One is,
we'll be
would
quick.
you also do a G7 calibration specifically for jobs that use soft touch?
I would, yes. A lot of times when I'm in a printing plant doing calibration, anything that's going to be color critical that has a different coating may end up with its own calibration if it has to be that accurate. So for typical examples would be UV gloss. Super glossy UV changes the color quite a bit and darkens everything. Soft touch might, but anything that's going to shift the color, if the expectation is a good color match, then you may consider doing a separate calibration. Mark, are you still on the line?
Yes, we are still on the line, Ron.
Yeah. So what would you do if the coating is so different and changes the work? Would you do a separate calibration for maybe that one type of work? Not for many, but maybe for that?
Yes, we would.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
and Steve, you have one more?
Actually, I have about 5 more, but
okay, we'll go quick. We'll do those 5. Yeah.
Pardon me? All right.
Yeah, we'll do those 5. Yeah.
Let's see here. And we may not get to everybody's questions, but I'll send out the list of questions to Ron there, and you can take a look at it. Next question here. In Flexo inline measuring instruments like ITX or SpectraDrive, works? I can repeat that. In Flexo, inline measuring instruments like ITX or SpectraDrive, can that work? Rephrasing a little bit.
Yeah, they can work, but there are also devices that can read it live so you don't have to cut a sheet. And Dan, would you agree with that? Like there's devices that can actually read it so you're not having to pull a sheet off and cut it.
That's right. I mean, the IntelliTrax, the ITX, it's abbreviated for the IntelliTrax, and the SpectraDrive, we've seen some people use them in Flexo operations. I will be honest and say those devices are intended for offset. Those are meant, for that type of sheet-fed type work. The best devices, I would say, are an inline device you mount on your press. There are a few different options out there. BST makes one called the IPQ. That's a spectrophotometer that measures the web as it's moving. Peshcon has one. AVT is another well-known name that's doing that stuff. QuadTech has stuff. So these are a little bit more expensive instruments because they do have to be mounted on your equipment and they're measuring in line, sometimes moving side to side to capture different areas of the web. But they really are worth the investment just because the data you're getting live as materials being printed can really be acted upon very easily without having to wait, say, to the end of the roll and take a sample there or stop the web for measurement manually by hand.
Yep, great. Steve?
Yep, another question. And reminder to everybody, you'll get a recording too. If you do need to drop off, you'll get the full recording. But another question is, what about metallic media considerations, especially with spot white under InDesign? Ooh, goodie for the internet.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah. Metallic is hard because technically we're supposed to have a different type of instrument to actually measure metallic. White on metallic we can measure, but metallic itself we can't measure without a different type of instrument. Then there are no graphic arts standards for metallic. It's mostly for industrial. So it's very challenging, metallic. That's the one that usually there's no great answer for it.
Yeah, Ron, let me add a really important point that you've opened up an interesting topic. The instrument Ron's talking about is called a spherical spectrophotometer. What I want to add is that a spherical device measures at a different degree, a different angle than a 045, like we've been talking about so far, the IntelliTrax, the Exact, all these devices made for the printing side of the business generally are 045 geometry based. The point that's really important is you cannot mix readings from a 045 to a sphere. The LAB color target values you may have for one geometry are not compatible or convertible to the other type of geometry. So if you are going to measure metallic, if that is not suitable to be measured depending on the amount of fleck in it, that a 045 can't handle it, you'll want to use a spherical device and you will want to measure in with that sphere into whatever software you're using, the color targets, your standards, and compare those to only sphere-based samples. So you kind of have to stay in those separate camps or those separate families depending on the type of work you're measuring because there's just no compatibility between them.
Yep, great. No, that comes up over and over and over. With the high-end, high-quality brands, that's the challenge.
And for my panelists, you may get questions sent directly to you in your chat box. They usually will come to me, the host, but sometimes folks will send directly to you, so you can see that if you see a good question. And Bruce answered this question directly for somebody, but I want to read it out here just because I think it's a good one for everyone to hear, which was when comparing, and Bruce, you might want to answer it, go out loud. When comparing quality and consistency across print suppliers, how important is it to have them all using the same color bar elements in that comparison?
Bruce?
And I stated it's good to have everyone on the same page. I originally thought that they were talking about instruments and stuff, but they just were talking about color bars, so I probably misrepresented my answer on that a little bit. But I still believe that that it's good to have everybody on the same page doing the same thing. Setting up good color communication at the outset is very important to having everybody happy with the results at the end.
Yeah. No, and I think it's important to have the same elements because if everyone's going to be judged, so if you had 5 suppliers and they're all going to be judged by this print buyer, you have to have the same elements for it to be fair, you know, to really be able to compare and for everyone to have a chance. So I think consistency is important to have the same type of elements. And for example, if G7 was important to you, then, you know, having that gray in every color bar would be important, or that same spot color, or, you know, if it was an overprint or a tin. So I think it's important across the supply chain.
And then really like one more, maybe 2 more questions here real quick.
Yeah.
Well, there's a question around varnish. If varnish impact on the color bar, what should we do to get accurate measurement? And you talk a little bit about varnish and color bars.
Yeah, varnish does impact the color bar, and it changes it, and it's really important to, you know, to measure the coated or the varnished bar. I think the thing, and you guys can tell me if you would agree or not agree, and same, you know, Mark and Roger on your end, but you know, the danger point with varnish for me usually is when it is made with OBAs. So if it's full of OBAs, then it throws off in a different direction. But in general, it's, you know, the color bar should have the same effect that the work in the middle of the page has.
But there's another interesting question here that was right below that one that I'll read because it's a good question to bring up that ties into varnishing and stuff like that. And they stated, drawdowns have no varnish, proofs have no varnish, press sheets have varnish applied. Why would I place varnish over the color bars?
But not true, because your ink company can produce a coated drawdown if you request.
Oh, yes, agree. But the interesting thing was that proofs have no varnish, and this is true. But if we're actually simulating a press condition, we could simulate how varnish was on that plate if we made a custom profile, so that the proofer would represent how varnish would react on that press sheet, just like we simulate uncoated sheets versus coated sheets.
Yeah, and that would be an example. Would be that UV, gloss coating has such a different appearance than the regular sheet that many printers end up with a separate proofing queue for that one, just because the printability and the print characteristics are too different from just a normal proof. Yeah.
Well, okay, let's go ahead and conclude right here. Ron, I'll give you the final word, but before, just to let everybody know, we'll get that recording out. That'll come from Tim Baechle, who is traveling right now internationally. So expect that in 24 to 48 hours. I'll get it to him right away, and then he will get it out to all the registrants so you can hear the recording. And I want to thank everybody for joining our webinar today too, particularly our attendees and our presenters, Ron Ellis, Bruce Bain, Dan Uris, and also Mark Richard, Guy, Paige, and Roger for showing their sample too. So we usually run this about every month. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ron or the team there with any concluding thoughts for our webinar for today.
Thank you very much for attending, and for the panelists, from Westrock, Marky, and Roger. Thank you for sharing, because to share what you do to other people is great for them to see real examples instead of just the same old guys like us talking about stuff. And for Dan and Bruce, thanks for taking the time and being prepared and working on this. And have a great weekend, everybody. It's Friday, and look forward to a good weekend. And next month we'll have another topic that relates to this idea of communicating and doing good brand work and tying everything together. So have a great weekend, and thanks very much for showing up. And if you have questions, just send us emails. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice week. Have a nice week.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks, and have a great weekend.
Przeczytam. Przeczytaj, Oui, ça, oui. Ça pourrait être là. Puis s'il n'y a pas de téléphone, sauf ça. On peut pas, oui, on peut appeler. Mais il faut toujours, tu peux pas prendre en privé. Ah, oui, mon enfant, je crois que c'est une salle de compétences. Elle prend des mauvaises formes.